I had sent my late daughter's husband $55,000 every year for 8 years, and I thought I knew exactly where every penny was going. I was wrong. "Grandpa, what money?" my granddaughter Sophie asked, staring at me across the restaurant table with a confused expression that instantly turned my world upside down. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard her. The graduation party around us continued as if nothing had happened. Plates clinked. People laughed. A waiter carried a tray of desserts through the crowded private room. But all I could hear were those 3 words echoing inside my head. "What money?" I forced a smile and leaned slightly closer. "The college fund money, sweetheart," I said. "The money I've been sending your father every year since your mom passed away." Sophie blinked twice. "Grandpa, Dad never told me about any college fund." My chest tightened. I looked down at my coffee cup, suddenly aware that my hand was trembling. Across the room, Jason was laughing with a group of relatives, holding a glass of iced tea and looking completely relaxed. 8 years earlier, when my daughter Emily lost her battle with illness, I made a promise beside her hospital bed. I promised her that I would always look after Sophie. Emily had been my only child. Losing her felt like losing an entire future. In those difficult days after the funeral, Jason looked broken. He was a widower raising a little girl who had just lost her mother. I wanted to help. More importantly, I believed Emily would have wanted me to help. So every year, without fail, I transferred $55,000 into an account Jason designated for Sophie's future. College, housing, opportunities, security, things Emily would have wanted for her daughter. 8 years, $440,000. And now Sophie was looking at me as though she had never heard about any of it. "Maybe your dad called it something else," I said carefully. "Maybe he didn't mention where it came from." Sophie shook her head. "Grandpa, Dad always says we can't afford a lot of things. He says college loans are probably going to be necessary." The room suddenly felt warmer. Too warm. I loosened my tie and glanced toward Jason again. He caught my eye and raised his hand with a friendly smile. I smiled back automatically. Anyone watching would have thought it was a perfectly normal family gathering. Inside, however, something had shifted. Something small. Something dangerous. For years, I had trusted Jason completely. I never asked for reports. I never asked for statements. I never asked for proof. He was family. He was Emily's husband. That was enough for me. Or at least it had been. Sophie leaned forward. "Grandpa, are you okay?" I nodded. "Just an old man thinking too much." She smiled softly. "You've always worried about everybody. Emily used to say the same thing." Hearing those words from her daughter nearly broke my heart. I looked around the room. Family members chatted happily. Graduation banners hung from the walls. A slideshow of Sophie's childhood photos played on a large screen in the corner. In picture after picture, I saw Emily's smile reflected in her daughter's face. And for the first time in 8 years, I felt something I never thought I would feel toward Jason. Doubt. Not anger. Not yet. Just doubt. Quiet. Persistent. Unwelcome. The kind of doubt that refuses to leave once it enters the room. I finished my coffee, smiled through the rest of the celebration, and congratulated Sophie on her graduation. But deep inside, a question had already taken root. If Sophie never received a single dollar of the money I had sent for her future, then where had $440,000 actually gone? That night, after the graduation party ended, I drove home alone with the radio turned off. The silence inside my truck felt heavier than usual. The summer sun had already disappeared below the horizon, leaving only the glow of streetlights reflecting across the windshield. Normally, after spending time with Sophie, I felt lighter, proud, hopeful. Emily had raised a wonderful daughter, and seeing pieces of her mother in her smile always brought me comfort. But this time was different. Sophie had unknowingly planted a question in my mind that refused to leave. When I walked into my house, I did what I always did. I hung my keys beside the front door. I poured myself a glass of water. I checked the thermostat. Small routines. Familiar routines. The kind that make a house feel less empty. Emily had been gone for 8 years, yet there were still moments when I expected to hear her voice. Sometimes grief does not leave. It simply changes shape. I carried my glass into the study and sat behind the old oak desk where I handled my finances. The room smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Family photographs lined the shelves. Emily at 12 holding a softball trophy. Emily on her wedding day. Emily cradling Sophie as a newborn. I stared at those pictures for a long time. Then I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a thick folder labeled simply, Sophie. For years, I had kept every document related to the money I sent. Not because I doubted Jason, but because old habits die hard. I had spent 4 decades running a business. Records mattered. Organization mattered. I opened the folder and slowly reviewed the documents. There they were. 8 annual transfers. $55,000 each. Every transfer completed on the same date each year. Every confirmation neatly filed. Every receipt preserved. $440,000. Looking at the total written across those pages made me sit back in my chair. It was a substantial amount of money. Enough to change a young person's future. Enough to pay for an excellent education. Enough to help someone start a career without carrying years of debt. Yet Sophie had looked genuinely confused when I mentioned it. Not surprised. Not cautious. Confused. There is a difference. People can fake surprise. Genuine confusion is harder to imitate. I leaned back and closed my eyes. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe Jason had invested the money under a different account. Maybe he planned to tell Sophie later. Maybe I was allowing one awkward conversation to distort 8 years of trust. That was the explanation I wanted to believe. But another memory surfaced. About 3 years earlier, Sophie had mentioned that her laptop was failing. I remembered offering to buy her a new one. Jason had quickly stepped in and said they could not justify the expense. At the time, I respected his desire to teach financial responsibility. Now that memory felt different. Then another surfaced. Last Christmas, Sophie had talked about applying to several universities. Jason immediately shifted the conversation towards student loans and part-time jobs. Again, I thought nothing of it. Plenty of families discuss those realities. But tonight, each memory seemed to carry a different weight. Around midnight, I stood and walked toward the bookshelf. A framed photograph sat on the top shelf. Emily and me at a county fair years ago. She was laughing at something I had said. Her eyes were bright. Her future still stretched endlessly ahead of her. I picked up the frame and held it carefully. I hope I am wrong, I whispered. I really do. Because if I was right, then the man I had trusted for nearly a decade had not simply mishandled money. He had betrayed the promise I made to my daughter. And deep down, for the first time, I feared that tomorrow might bring answers I was not prepared to hear. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Sleep had come in short stretches, interrupted by the same questions circling through my mind. By 6 o'clock, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and the folder still open beside me. Sunlight crept across the hardwood floor while the house remained perfectly quiet. 8 years is a long time. Long enough for habits to form. Long enough for trust to become automatic. That realization bothered me more than anything else. I had never verified where the money went because I never imagined I would need to. Around 8 o'clock, I called my financial advisor, a man named Richard Lawson who had helped manage my accounts for nearly 20 years. Richard answered on the second ring. After a few minutes of small talk, I asked him a simple question. Richard, can you pull up every transfer I have made to Jason Miller over the past 8 years? There was a brief pause. Of course. Is something wrong? I am not sure yet, I replied. That is what I am trying to find out. An hour later, I was sitting in his office. Richard placed a stack of documents in front of me and adjusted his glasses. Every transfer was there. Every date matched my records. Every amount matched perfectly. $55,000, year after year. Nothing unusual on my end. Everything had been delivered exactly as instructed. The funds definitely arrived, Richard said. There were never any reversals or rejected transactions. I nodded slowly. That answer eliminated one possibility. The money had not disappeared during transfer. It reached Jason every single time. As I drove home, I found myself noticing things I had ignored before. Jason's house came to mind. The kitchen renovation he completed 2 years ago. The luxury pickup truck he bought last summer. The family vacation photographs he occasionally posted online. At the time, none of those things seemed suspicious. Jason had a decent career. Successful people buy nice things. But now I started adding numbers in my head. The renovations. The vehicles. The vacations. The timing. By afternoon, I found myself scrolling through years of old photographs on social media. I felt foolish doing it, like an old detective in a television show. Yet the deeper I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. There were pictures from a ski resort in Colorado. Pictures from a beachfront property in Florida. Pictures from restaurants where dinner for two probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. Meanwhile, Sophie had spent years talking about scholarships, financial aid, and student loans. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Late that evening, another memory surfaced. About 18 months earlier, Sophie had mentioned a school trip to Washington, D.C. She seemed excited about it. A week later, she told me she could not go because the cost was too high. I remembered offering to cover the expense. Jason immediately declined and said it would teach her responsibility. At the time, I admired the lesson. Now I wondered whether there had been another reason. I sat in my study and stared at Emily's photograph again. The feeling growing inside me was not anger. Not yet. It was disappointment. Deep disappointment. Because every answer seemed to create two new questions. Then my phone buzzed. A text message from Sophie appeared on the screen. "Grandpa, thank you again for coming yesterday. It meant a lot to me." I smiled despite everything. She had always been thoughtful. Then another message appeared a few seconds later. "By the way, Dad has been acting strange all day. He keeps asking what we talked about after lunch." I read the message twice. Slowly, I set the phone down on my desk. Until that moment, I had wondered whether I was imagining things, whether grief and age were making me suspicious. But Jason's sudden interest in our conversation told me something important. He was worried. And people rarely worry unless there is something they do not want discovered. The following morning, I decided to stop guessing and start looking for facts. At my age, I had learned that assumptions can be expensive, especially when family is involved. I drove to a small diner a few miles from my house, ordered eggs and toast, and sat in a corner booth with my notebook. For nearly an hour, I wrote down every memory that suddenly seemed different in light of what Sophie had told me. The list grew longer than I expected. There was the Washington trip she missed, the laptop she never received, the endless conversations about scholarships and loans. Then there were the photographs. Dozens of photographs. Vacations. Home renovations. New vehicles. Expensive hobbies. None of those things proved anything on their own, but together they painted a picture that made me uncomfortable. After breakfast, I drove home and began organizing everything. One stack contained financial records. Another contained notes about conversations I remembered. A third held printed photographs from social media. Looking at them spread across my desk felt strange. This was not how I imagined spending my retirement years. I should have been planning fishing trips and enjoying visits with my granddaughter. Instead, I was quietly investigating the man I had treated like a son for nearly a decade. Around noon, my phone rang. It was Jason. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but I answered. His voice sounded cheerful, almost too cheerful. He asked about my health, the weather, and a baseball game neither of us had watched. The conversation felt forced. Finally, he worked his way toward the question he really wanted to ask. "Sophie mentioned you two had quite a conversation at the graduation party," he said casually. "Everything okay?" I looked out the window toward my backyard. "Of course," I replied. "Just family catching up." There was a brief silence. Not long, just long enough to notice. Then he laughed and changed the subject. When the call ended, I sat motionless for several seconds. Something had changed. Jason was probing. Carefully, indirectly, but probing nonetheless. Later that afternoon, I received another surprise. Sophie stopped by unexpectedly. She was carrying a folder from her school counselor's office. We sat at the kitchen table while she explained the financial aid packages she had been reviewing. Most of it was unfamiliar to her, so she wanted a second opinion. I listened carefully as she described tuition estimates, housing costs, and student loan options. What struck me was not the numbers. It was the fact that she spoke as though she had no financial support available whatsoever. No trust fund, no education account, no savings plan, nothing. When she left, she accidentally forgot one of the papers on the table. As I picked it up, a handwritten note caught my attention. It was a simple budgeting worksheet completed by Sophie. She had carefully estimated how many hours she would need to work each week to help pay for college. I stared at that page for a long time. Then I looked at the stack of transfer confirmations sitting on my desk. $440,000. 8 years of sacrifice. 8 years of trust. And my granddaughter was preparing to work late shifts just to afford textbooks. That was the moment something settled inside me. Not anger. Not revenge. Clarity. Whatever explanation existed, I intended to find it. Because one thing had become impossible to ignore. The life I believed I had been helping Sophie build did not exist. Somewhere between my bank account and her future, the truth had disappeared, and I was beginning to suspect that Jason knew exactly where it had gone. The next week, I decided it was time to stop looking at clues and start looking for evidence. I called an old friend named Michael Turner, a retired accountant who had spent nearly 40 years examining financial records. We had known each other since our 20s. Michael was the kind of man who noticed details other people missed. When I explained the situation, he listened without interrupting. After I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Harold, if you want the truth, stop asking what happened to the money. Ask where the money should have been." That simple sentence stayed with me. 2 days later, Michael and I sat in my study reviewing everything I had collected. Bank transfers, dates, notes, photographs, conversations. He examined each document carefully. Every so often he would jot something down on a yellow legal pad. After several hours, he pointed to the transfer records. "You always sent the money directly to Jason?" he asked. "Every year," I replied, because he told me he was managing Sophie's future accounts. Michael nodded slowly. "And you never received a single statement showing where the funds were held?" I stared at him. The answer sounded obvious now. "No." He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Harold, that is a lot of trust." Hearing those words from someone else made the situation feel even heavier. That evening, I found myself revisiting memories I had not thought about in years. Shortly after Emily passed away, Jason used to call me regularly. He would update me on Sophie, tell me about school activities, share photographs. Over time, those calls became less frequent. Then they became rare. Eventually, most communication happened during holidays and birthdays. At the time, I assumed life had simply become busy. Now I wondered if distance had been useful to him. Distance makes questions less likely. Distance makes accountability easier to avoid. A few days later, another piece of information arrived unexpectedly. Sophie called and asked if I could help her review some college paperwork. We met at a small coffee shop near her school. As we sat together going through forms, she casually mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. "Dad keeps saying we should be careful because there is no safety net," she said. "No backup money. No family fund. Nothing like that." I felt my stomach tighten. I kept my expression calm. "Has he always said that?" Sophie nodded. "Pretty much since I was little." For a moment, neither of us spoke. I looked out the window at cars passing through the intersection. Then I changed the subject. I did not want her carrying the burden of my suspicions. Not yet. When I returned home, I wrote down every word she had said. Then I added it to the growing file on my desk. The folder was becoming thicker by the day. The evidence was still incomplete, but a pattern was emerging. Every path led back to the same uncomfortable conclusion. Sophie had spent years believing there was nothing waiting for her future. Yet I had spent those same years building what should have been a substantial foundation for that future. Somewhere between those two realities was a lie. Late that night, Michael called. His voice sounded unusually serious. "Harold, I found something interesting." I sat up straighter in my chair. "What is it?" There was a brief pause before he answered. "I think Jason may have purchased something very expensive around the same time your annual transfers arrived each year." My grip tightened around the phone. For the first time since this began, I felt the truth moving closer. And I was no longer sure I was going to like what I found. The next afternoon, Michael arrived at my house carrying a thin folder under his arm. The look on his face told me he had found something important. We sat in the study, and for several moments neither of us spoke. Finally, he opened the folder and slid several printed pages across my desk. "I cannot prove where your money went," he said carefully, "but I can show you a pattern." I picked up the first page. It contained public property records. The dates immediately caught my attention. 8 years ago, only months after Emily passed away, Jason purchased a vacation condominium near a lake about 3 hours from his home. The timing matched almost exactly with the first transfer I had sent. I turned to the next page. 3 years later, records showed extensive renovations on the property. Again, the dates lined up closely with another annual transfer. Then came the next document. A luxury vehicle purchase. Another year. Another transfer. Another large expense. My stomach felt heavy as I reviewed the paperwork. None of it was illegal. None of it directly connected my money to those purchases. But the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every time I provided financial support intended for Sophie's future, Jason's lifestyle seemed to improve. Meanwhile, Sophie had spent years worrying about tuition costs and student loans. Michael pointed toward the papers. Maybe it is coincidence, he said. But if it is one of the biggest coincidences I have ever seen. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Part of me still wanted another explanation. Some hidden account. Some misunderstanding. Some detail that would make everything make sense. But that hope was growing weaker with every new fact. 2 days later, another piece of the puzzle arrived unexpectedly. Sophie called and asked whether I wanted to have lunch together. We met at a small sandwich shop near the community college campus. She seemed distracted, nervous. After a few minutes of conversation, she looked down at her drink and quietly said, "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. Of course. She hesitated before speaking. Did my mom ever talk about me going to college? The question caught me off guard. All the time, I answered. Education was incredibly important to her. Sophie smiled sadly. Dad always says Mom would have wanted me to be practical and avoid expensive schools. I felt something tighten inside my chest. That did not sound like Emily. Not even a little. Emily had believed in chasing opportunities. She believed in dreaming bigger than your circumstances. Sophie continued speaking. Sometimes I feel guilty for wanting more. I looked at my granddaughter and suddenly realized something that hurt even more than the missing money. For years, someone had been shaping her expectations downward, convincing her to settle, convincing her that support was unavailable, convincing her that limitations were normal. When we finished lunch, I sat in my truck for nearly 20 minutes before driving home. The financial questions were serious. But now another concern had appeared. If Jason had hidden the truth about the money, what else had he been telling Sophie all these years? That evening, I opened an old storage box in the closet. Inside were letters, photographs, and personal notes Emily had written before she passed away. I spent hours reading them. Then I found something that made my heart stop. It was a handwritten letter addressed to Sophie. Emily had written it during her final months. Near the bottom of the page was a sentence I could never forget. Never let anyone convince you that your dreams are too expensive. I sat there staring at those words for a very long time. Then I carefully placed the letter back into its envelope. For the first time since this began, I was no longer investigating a financial mystery. I was uncovering a much deeper betrayal. And the closer I moved toward the truth, the more certain I became that Jason had spent years hiding far more than money. After reading Emily's letter, I stopped searching for excuses. For weeks, I had been hoping for some innocent explanation that would put everything back where it belonged. That hope was gone now. The facts were leading in one direction, and pretending otherwise would only delay the truth. Still, I was not ready to confront Jason. Not yet. If I had learned anything from running a business, it was that people reveal more when they think they are safe. So I decided to do something that surprised even me. I acted exactly the same. I continued answering Jason's calls. I laughed at his jokes. I attended family dinners. I asked about work and listened politely to stories about home projects and weekend plans. If he was hiding something, I wanted him comfortable. Comfortable people become careless. A week later, Jason invited me to his house for a barbecue. The invitation arrived so suddenly that it felt almost strategic. As I pulled into the driveway that Saturday afternoon, I noticed several upgrades that had not been there the previous year. New outdoor furniture, professional landscaping, a recently installed stone patio. None of it was outrageous by itself, but together it represented a significant amount of money. Inside the house, Sophie greeted me warmly. Jason seemed unusually attentive. He offered me drinks, asked about my health, and even brought up memories of Emily. Watching him was like watching an actor perform a familiar role. Everything appeared normal on the surface, yet I could not stop seeing the cracks underneath. During dinner, Sophie mentioned a university she was considering. It was an excellent school several states away. Her eyes lit up as she described the program. Before she could finish, Jason interrupted. He smiled, but there was something firm behind it. That school is probably unrealistic, he said. The debt would be enormous. Sophie immediately grew quiet. I noticed it happen in real time. The excitement disappeared from her face. She lowered her eyes and changed the subject. Nobody else seemed to notice. But I did, because I had just read a letter from Emily telling her daughter never to let anyone convince her that her dreams were too expensive. That moment stayed with me long after I returned home. 2 days later, Michael called again. This time he sounded almost shocked. He had uncovered additional public records connected to the lake property Jason owned. The property had recently been refinanced. The estimated value had increased dramatically over the years. As Michael explained the numbers, a troubling possibility emerged. The annual transfers may not have simply funded vacations or luxury purchases. They may have helped build a substantial personal asset, an asset Sophie knew nothing about. I sat quietly after the call ended. Then I opened my notebook and started writing. Dates, events, statements, financial records, patterns. Every page brought the picture into sharper focus. Yet one question continued bothering me. Why had Jason become so interested in my conversation with Sophie after the graduation party? The answer arrived sooner than expected. 3 nights later, my phone rang just before 9 o'clock. It was Sophie. Her voice sounded hesitant. "Grandpa, can I ask you something strange?" she said. "Of course." There was a pause. "Did you and Dad ever argue about money?" My heart skipped a beat. "No." "What?" Another pause followed. Then she spoke softly. "Because earlier tonight, I walked into the kitchen and heard Dad talking on the phone. He sounded upset. He said, if Harold starts asking questions, everything could fall apart." I closed my eyes and gripped the arm of my chair. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Sophie quietly added, "Grandpa, what exactly is going on?" And for the first time since this began, I realized the moment of truth was getting closer than either of us imagined. After Sophie asked that question, I realized I could no longer protect her from the truth by staying silent. But I also knew that accusations without proof could destroy relationships and leave permanent scars. So I chose my words carefully. I told her there were some financial matters I was reviewing and that I needed a little more time before drawing conclusions. She listened quietly. When I finished, she surprised me. "Grandpa," she said softly, "I think you are trying to protect me." I stared at the phone in silence. Then she added, "But I am not a little kid anymore." After we hung up, I sat alone in my study for a long time. She was right. Sophie was no longer the little girl who used to sit on my shoulders at county fairs. She was an adult preparing to build her own future. And that future deserved the truth. The next morning, Michael arrived with another stack of documents. This time he was accompanied by an attorney named Laura Bennett, a specialist in estate planning and financial trusts. Over coffee, I explained everything from the beginning. The transfers, the conversations, the missing education fund, Emily's letter, Sophie's concerns. Laura listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands and looked directly at me. "Harold, before you confront anyone, you need a complete picture. Not an emotional picture. A factual one." I nodded. That was exactly what I wanted. Facts. Over the following week, Laura helped organize every document into a timeline. Together we built a record stretching back 8 years. Every transfer, every major purchase, every relevant conversation. As the timeline grew, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The annual financial support consistently coincided with periods when Jason's assets and lifestyle improved. Meanwhile, there was no evidence that substantial funds had been reserved for Sophie's education. Even Laura, who remained careful with her conclusions, admitted the situation raised serious questions. Then something unexpected happened. Sophie called again. This time she sounded upset. Earlier that day, she had received a university acceptance letter from one of her top choices. It was a remarkable opportunity. The program was competitive, the school highly respected, and the financial aid package surprisingly generous. Yet instead of celebrating, she sounded discouraged. "Dad says it is unrealistic," she told me. "He says I should stay local and choose the cheapest option possible." I closed my eyes. The same pattern, the same limitation, the same message she had been hearing for years. Dream smaller. Expect less. Settle. After we ended the call, I walked into the backyard and sat on the old wooden bench Emily loved. The evening air was cool. Birds moved through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a lawn mower hummed. Ordinary sounds. Peaceful sounds. Yet my thoughts were anything but peaceful. I thought about the future Emily wanted for her daughter. I thought about the sacrifices I had made believing I was helping create that future. Most of all, I thought about Sophie slowly learning that the world might have been much larger than she had been told. A few days later, Laura called with one final recommendation. "It is time," she said. "You have enough information. Not enough to make accusations publicly, but enough to ask direct questions." I thanked her and ended the call. Then I opened my calendar. The following Sunday was Sophie's family dinner. Everyone would be there. Jason, Sophie, a few relatives. Just another ordinary gathering. At least that was what they would believe. As I stared at the date, I felt surprisingly calm. For weeks, I had followed clues, gathered records, and questioned my own judgment. That uncertainty was gone now. I was not planning a confrontation fueled by anger. I was preparing for a conversation guided by facts. And for the first time since this entire journey began, I had the feeling that someone else's confidence was about to disappear. Sunday arrived with clear skies and unusually cool weather. I arrived at Jason's house a few minutes early carrying nothing more than a small folder and a calm expression. Inside, everything looked normal. Relatives chatted in the living room. Food was spread across the kitchen island. Sophie greeted me with a hug. Jason smiled when he saw me and offered me a drink. For a moment, it almost felt like any other family gathering. That was the strange thing about life. Sometimes the most important moments begin looking completely ordinary. We sat down for dinner shortly afterward. Conversation drifted from sports to travel plans to Sophie's college decisions. I listened more than I spoke. When dessert was served, I placed my fork down and looked across the table at Sophie. "I received some wonderful news about your university acceptance," I said. Her face brightened immediately. Before she could respond, Jason gently cleared his throat. "We are still evaluating options," he said. "Some dreams come with a very expensive price tag." Several people nodded politely. I opened the folder beside my chair. "That depends," I replied calmly. "Sometimes the money is already there." The room became quiet. Not dramatically quiet, just enough for everyone to notice. Jason's smile faded slightly. I removed several documents and placed them on the table. For the last 8 years, I transferred $55,000 annually for Sophie's future. Nobody spoke. Sophie stared at me. Jason remained motionless. I continued. The total amount exceeded $440,000. Sophie's eyes widened. A cousin quietly set down her glass. Across the table, Jason finally laughed. It sounded forced. "Harold, this is not really the time for financial discussions." "Actually," I said, "it is exactly the time." Then I handed Sophie copies of the transfer records. She looked down at the pages, then back at me. Confusion slowly gave way to disbelief. "This is real?" she asked. "Every single transfer," I answered. Jason's face had lost all color. For a moment, he seemed unable to decide whether to speak or remain silent. Finally, he looked at me. "You do not understand the full situation." "Then help us understand," I said quietly. No anger, no raised voice, just a simple invitation. The silence that followed felt endless. Eventually, Jason began explaining. First, he spoke about financial pressures, then unexpected expenses, then difficult years after Emily passed away. Some of what he said may even have been true. Life is complicated. Grief is complicated. But none of his explanations answered the central question. Why had Sophie spent years believing there was no support available for her future? Why had she prepared for overwhelming debt while substantial resources had existed all along? Sophie listened without interrupting. When Jason finished, she looked down at the documents in her hands. Then she spoke so softly that everyone leaned forward to hear her. "You never told me." Jason opened his mouth, but no words came out. In that moment, the conversation stopped being about money. It became about trust, about choices, about years of withheld truth. I reached into the folder one final time and removed Emily's letter. Carefully, I handed it to Sophie. She unfolded the paper and began reading. Tears filled her eyes as she reached the sentence I had discovered weeks earlier. "Never let anyone convince you that your dreams are too expensive." When she finished, she looked at me. Then she smiled through her tears. It was the same smile her mother used to have. The room remained silent. But something important had changed. The uncertainty was gone. The truth was no longer hidden. In the weeks that followed, Laura helped establish a protected educational trust directly in Sophie's name using assets that remained under my control. For the first time, she could make decisions based on opportunity instead of fear. As for me, I finally felt at peace. Not because everything ended perfectly. Families are rarely that simple. I felt at peace because I had kept my promise. 8 years earlier, beside my daughter's hospital bed, I promised to protect her child. It took longer than I expected. The path was far more painful than I imagined. But in the end, Sophie's future belonged to her again. And I think Emily would have been proud of that.